On the morning of October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs was at his home in Palo Alto, California. By this point, his health had already reached an advanced and critical stage. According to publicly confirmed accounts, he was no longer fully conscious for extended periods, and his physical condition had been declining steadily in the days leading up to this morning. The setting inside the house was quiet and controlled. There were no visitors, no media presence, and no public activity. This was consistent with how Steve Jobs had chosen to handle his illness in its final stages. Privacy had been maintained deliberately, and the home environment reflected that decision. Jobs had been battling a rare form of pancreatic cancer for several years. While he had undergone surgery and a liver transplant in the past, his condition continued to deteriorate over time. By early October 2011, there were no new treatments underway and no public medical updates being issued. What remained was a period of care focused on comfort rather than intervention. Family members were present in the house. His wife, Laureen Powell Jobs, along with his children and close relatives, remained nearby. No Apple executives or colleagues were present at the residence that morning. There were no work-related meetings or discussions scheduled. The focus of the day was entirely personal and private. As the morning progressed, Jobs' level of awareness fluctuated. According to family accounts, he experienced moments of limited consciousness earlier, but these periods became shorter and less frequent. He was physically weak and spent most of his time resting. There were no emergency situations, no sudden changes, and no hospital transfer planned. Outside the home, the world continued as usual. Just one day earlier, Apple had unveiled the iPhone 4S. Steve Jobs did not attend the event, nor did he appear publicly. Reports later confirmed that he had followed the announcement from home. This moment underscored the contrast between Apple's ongoing success and the private reality unfolding inside the Palo Alto residence. By late morning, the situation inside the house remained unchanged. Jobs was surrounded by family, and the environment stayed calm and restrained. There were no official statements, no preparations for announcements, and no indication to the public that this day would soon carry historical significance. At this point, nothing about the setting suggested urgency or disruption. The final 24 hours were unfolding quietly, largely unseen, in the same controlled manner that had defined Steve Jobs' approach to his personal life for years. As the day continued, the focus inside the Palo Alto home remained on the reality of Steve Jobs' long illness rather than on any single moment. By this stage, his condition was not sudden or unexpected. It was the result of a medical journey that had unfolded over nearly a decade and had been publicly acknowledged in parts, but largely managed in private. Jobs had been diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer in 2003. Unlike more aggressive forms of the disease, this cancer progressed slowly, allowing him to continue working for years after diagnosis. He underwent surgery in 2004 to remove the tumor, and for a period, his health appeared stable. However, over time, complications developed, and his condition gradually worsened. In 2009, Jobs received a liver transplant, a fact that was later confirmed publicly. The procedure was intended to address complications related to his illness, not to cure it entirely. After the transplant, he returned to Apple and continued to play an active role, but the long-term effects of both the disease and its treatment continued to take a toll on his body. By 2010 and into 2011, signs of physical decline became increasingly visible. Jobs appeared thinner, moved more slowly, and limited his public appearances. Apple did not issue detailed medical updates, and Jobs himself avoided discussing specifics. This approach reflected his long-standing preference for privacy and control over personal matters. In January 2011, Jobs announced another medical leave of absence, stating only that he would remain involved in major strategic decisions. No diagnosis or prognosis was shared publicly. Internally, Apple continued to function under Tim Cook's leadership, with Jobs remaining in the background. On August 24, 2011, Jobs formally resigned as Apple's chief executive officer. The resignation letter was brief and direct. He did not cite specific medical details, but the timing made it clear that his health no longer allowed him to lead the company day to day. He remained chairman of the board, signaling that the transition had been planned rather than abrupt. By the time October arrived, there were no further announcements expected. Jobs' condition had reached a stage where recovery was no longer anticipated. Care had shifted toward comfort, stability, and privacy. Inside the Palo Alto home, the long arc of the illness had narrowed into a final, quiet phase. Nothing about this progression was sudden. The final 24 hours were the conclusion of a process that had been unfolding for years, largely away from public view, and managed on Steve Jobs' own terms. As the hours moved forward, Steve Jobs' level of awareness became an important but carefully guarded part of the day. According to family accounts shared later, his consciousness during this period was limited and inconsistent. He was not fully alert for extended stretches of time, and moments of awareness came briefly before fading again. Earlier in the day, Jobs was able to recognize the presence of those closest to him. These moments were quiet and restrained, without extended conversation or activity. There were no meetings, no work discussions, and no attempts to engage with the outside world. His condition did not allow for sustained interaction, and those around him understood that energy had to be conserved. As the day progressed, these periods of awareness became shorter. Jobs spent most of his time resting. He was physically weak and required assistance with even minor movement. There were no signs of improvement, but there was also no sudden deterioration. The change was gradual and consistent with the progression of his illness. Family members remained nearby throughout the day. The atmosphere inside the house reflected an understanding of the situation without panic or urgency. There were no emergency medical interventions being introduced and no preparations for transport to a hospital. Decisions had already been made to keep the environment stable and familiar. During one of the earlier periods of awareness, Steve Jobs spoke a few final words. According to his sister, Mona Simpson, these words were simple and brief. He looked at his family and said, "Oh wow. Oh wow. Oh wow." Shortly after this, he lost consciousness. These words were not delivered as a statement or message, but as a quiet reaction in the moment. Following this point, Jobs did not regain meaningful awareness. He remained largely unconscious for the remainder of the day. His breathing continued, and his condition was monitored by those present, but there were no further interactions or communication. The decision to keep the final hours private was maintained throughout. No details were shared publicly, and no information was released outside the family. This approach was consistent with how Jobs had managed his illness from the beginning, revealing only what he chose and when he chose to reveal it. As the afternoon continued, the focus shifted entirely to presence rather than action. The remaining hours were not marked by events or decisions, but by the gradual narrowing of awareness and the steady progression toward the end of life. The final 24 hours continued to unfold quietly, without interruption, in the same controlled manner that had defined the day so far. As Steve Jobs' condition continued to decline, the people present inside the Palo Alto home remained limited to a very small circle. This was not a sudden decision made that day, but the result of choices that had been established well in advance. Jobs had been clear about how he wanted his final period handled, and those preferences were respected throughout. His wife, Laureen Powell Jobs, was with him. Their children were also present in the home, along with close family members, including his sisters. Among them was Mona Simpson, who would later share a brief account of his final moments. This small group constituted the entirety of those allowed into his immediate space. There were no Apple executives present at the house. No members of the company's leadership team were called in, and no business discussions took place. Although Jobs had remained chairman of the board after stepping down as CEO, his professional role did not extend into this final day. The boundary between his public identity and private life was firmly maintained. There were also no doctors arriving or departing throughout the day. Jobs was not being prepared for transfer to a medical facility, nor was there any escalation in treatment. His care had already shifted into a non-interventional phase, focused on comfort rather than medical action. This approach remained unchanged as the hours passed. Equally absent was any media presence. No journalists were informed, no photographers gathered nearby, and no statements were prepared during this period. Outside the home, there was no indication that anything out of the ordinary was occurring. The street remained quiet, and daily life in the surrounding area continued without interruption. This controlled environment reflected a pattern that had defined Jobs' approach to his illness for years. Public disclosures were rare and carefully timed. Even major health events, such as his liver transplant, had been acknowledged only after the fact. The final day followed the same principle of privacy and restraint. Inside the home, there was no attempt to mark the significance of the moment. There were no formal conversations, no rituals, and no announcements being drafted. The family's attention remained focused on being present rather than on documenting or managing events. As the day moved forward, the absence of outsiders became as meaningful as the presence of family. It underscored that this was not a public farewell or a corporate moment, but a strictly personal one. The final 24 hours continued to pass quietly, shaped more by deliberate absence than by visible activity. While the situation inside the Palo Alto home remained unchanged, events outside had unfolded just one day earlier that quietly framed the significance of this final period. On October 4, 2011, Apple had introduced the iPhone 4S during a public product event. The announcement was closely watched around the world and marked another major moment in the company's ongoing evolution. Steve Jobs did not attend the event. There was no appearance on stage, no recorded message, and no public acknowledgement from him. This absence was noticeable, but not unexpected. By that point, his health no longer allowed for travel or public engagement. Apple did not offer an explanation beyond what had already been made clear in previous months. According to later accounts, Jobs followed the announcement from home. This detail was shared without elaboration, and no further information was provided about his reaction or involvement. There were no reports of calls, messages, or instructions related to the launch on that day. The product announcement proceeded under the leadership structure that had already been put in place. The contrast between the public moment and the private reality was sharp but unspoken. While Apple continued to release new products and maintain its public presence, its co-founder was spending his final hours in a setting defined by silence and privacy. These two realities existed at the same time without intersecting. Jobs' role at Apple had already shifted. Although he had resigned as chief executive officer in August 2011, he remained chairman of the board. This position reflected continuity rather than active management. Strategic transitions had been completed well before October, ensuring that the company could operate without disruption. There was no indication that Jobs attempted to influence or comment on the iPhone 4S launch during this period. His involvement with Apple had gradually receded as his health declined, and by early October, it had effectively ended. What remained was the legacy of decisions already made, not new contributions. Inside the house, the day continued without reference to the outside world. There were no screens playing the keynote, no conversations about product features, and no acknowledgement of media coverage. The focus stayed entirely on the present moment and the people in the room. This quiet separation between public success and private decline was not addressed directly, but it defined the context of the final 24 hours. As Apple moved forward, Steve Jobs' final day unfolded apart from it, shaped by choices made long before this moment arrived. As the afternoon moved forward, Steve Jobs' physical condition continued to weaken in a predictable and steady way. There were no sudden changes or medical emergencies. What was happening inside the house was consistent with the advanced stage of his illness and the expectations that had already been understood by those around him. Jobs spent most of this period resting. He remained largely unconscious, with only brief moments of limited awareness earlier in the day. By this stage, those moments had become increasingly rare. There was no extended conversation, no deliberate interaction, and no activity beyond what was necessary for comfort and care. The environment inside the house remained stable. Curtains were drawn to control. Light, noise was kept to a minimum, and movement was limited. Family members stayed close, but there was no sense of urgency or confusion. The pace of the day slowed further, shaped by stillness rather than events. There were no decisions being made and no instructions being given. Jobs was not communicating plans, messages, or final requests. Accounts from family members indicate that this period was marked by presence rather than dialogue. The focus was on maintaining calm and continuity. Medical involvement did not increase. There were no new treatments introduced and no discussions about intervention. Jobs was not transferred to a hospital and no emergency services were contacted. His care remained consistent with earlier decisions to keep the final phase of his life private and familiar. Outside the home, there was still no awareness that this day would soon carry global significance. Apple continued normal operations. Media coverage focused on technology news, including the recent iPhone announcement. There were no statements or signals indicating that the company's co-founder was nearing the end of his life. As the afternoon progressed, the distance between the private reality inside the house and the public world beyond it remained complete. Jobs' condition did not prompt any outreach or preparation for announcements. Everything that would later become public remained contained within the family at this point. Time passed without markers. There were no clocks being watched and no schedules being followed. The day did not move toward a goal or event. Instead, it continued quietly, shaped by the slow and irreversible progression of his illness. By late afternoon, it was clear that the final hours were approaching, though nothing in the environment changed to acknowledge that fact. The house remained quiet. The people present remained the same, and the final 24 hours continued forward without interruption, following the same restrained pattern that had defined the day from the beginning. As the day moved into the evening, the atmosphere inside the Palo Alto home remained unchanged. There were no new developments, no sudden movements, and no external involvement. Steve Jobs' condition continued to follow the same steady course that had defined the earlier hours. By this point, he was no longer conscious in any meaningful way. Family members later indicated that there were no further moments of awareness or interaction. His breathing continued, but his physical strength had diminished significantly. There were no signs of agitation or distress. The process unfolded quietly and without interruption. Those present remained close, maintaining a calm and familiar environment. There were no conversations taking place around him, and no attempts were made to stimulate response. The focus remained on comfort and presence rather than engagement. Silence became a defining feature of the evening. No medical escalation occurred. There were no changes in care, no introduction of equipment, and no emergency preparations. Jobs remained at home, consistent with the plan that had been established well before this day. The absence of intervention reflected both the advanced stage of his illness and his preference for privacy. Outside the residence, nothing indicated that this was a significant evening. There were no lights, vehicles, or activity suggesting urgency. The surrounding neighborhood remained quiet, and there was no visible security response or disruption. Daily life continued normally beyond the walls of the house. As evening progressed, the separation between the private moment inside the home and the public world outside remained complete. There were no notifications sent, no statements drafted, and no coordination with Apple or any other organization. Everything related to this moment remained contained within the family. Time continued to pass without acknowledgement. There were no clocks being checked and no markers signaling transition. The evening did not bring a shift in mood or activity. Instead, it extended the same restrained stillness that had characterized the day. The approach of night did not introduce change, only continuation. Jobs' condition remained stable in its decline, and those around him maintained their positions. The house stayed quiet. The number of people present did not change. No decisions were made to alter the course of events. As darkness settled outside, the final phase of the day moved closer without announcement or recognition. The hours progressed not toward an event, but toward an inevitable conclusion that had already been understood. The final 24 hours continued forward in silence, uninterrupted and unseen. As night settled fully over Palo Alto, the conditions inside the house remained steady and controlled. There were no visible changes in the environment and no shift in how the situation was being handled. Steve Jobs' condition continued to decline in the same gradual and predictable manner that had defined the day. By this point, he was entirely unresponsive. There were no further moments of awareness, no communication, and no interaction with those around him. His breathing was present but increasingly shallow, consistent with the advanced stage of his illness. Those nearby remained attentive, but there was nothing to be done beyond maintaining comfort. The atmosphere in the room was quiet and restrained. Lights were kept low, noise was avoided, and movement was minimal. Family members stayed close, but there was no attempt to alter the course of events. Everything that was happening had already been anticipated, and there was no uncertainty about what the coming hours would bring. No medical intervention was introduced during this time. There were no emergency calls, no arrival of doctors, and no equipment brought into the room. The decision to remain at home remained unchanged. This was consistent with how Jobs had chosen to handle the final stage of his illness, without escalation or external involvement. Outside the home, the night passed without attention. There were no announcements, no media activity, and no indication to the public that anything was occurring. Apple issued no statements, and there were no internal communications triggered at this stage. The moment remained entirely private. As the night progressed, the sense of time became less distinct. Hours passed without markers or reference points. The focus inside the house remained on presence rather than progression. There was no anticipation of a specific moment, only an understanding that the process was nearing its end. Jobs's breathing continued to slow as the night moved forward. There was no sign of pain or agitation. Those present later described the environment as calm and quiet, without disruption or distress. The decline did not accelerate suddenly. It continued steadily. Nothing about the night altered the tone of the day that had preceded it. The same restraint, privacy, and control remained in place. The final hours unfolded without interruption, guided by decisions that had already been made long before this night began. As the night moved closer to its end, the situation inside the house remained unchanged. The final moments were approaching, not marked by events or action, but by the continued passage of time and silence. As the night continued, the final phase of Steve Jobs' life moved forward without interruption. Inside the Palo Alto home, nothing changed in terms of setting or presence. The same small group of family members remained nearby, and the environment stayed quiet and controlled. Jobs remained unresponsive. His breathing became slower and more irregular, a progression that was expected given his condition. There were no attempts to intervene and no discussions about altering the course of care. Everything that could be done had already been decided earlier, and those decisions were respected through the final hours. There was no sense of urgency in the room. No one was watching clocks or anticipating a precise moment. Time passed quietly, marked only by the gradual changes in his breathing. The atmosphere remained calm, without distress or visible struggle. At some point during the night, Steve Jobs stopped breathing. There was no sudden movement, no audible response, and no indication of pain. His passing occurred peacefully, in the same private setting where he had spent the day. He was 56 years old. The cause of death was later confirmed as respiratory arrest resulting from complications of pancreatic cancer. There were no external factors involved and no emergency response initiated. The death occurred at home, as planned, without transfer to a medical facility. Following the moment of his passing, the family remained present. There was no immediate public action taken and no announcements made. The house remained closed to the outside world, and the privacy that had defined the day was maintained. There were no cameras, no recordings, and no witnesses beyond those closest to him. This moment was not documented or shared in real time. It remained contained within the family, consistent with Jobs' long-standing approach to his personal life. Outside the residence, the world continued unaware. There were no reports, no alerts, and no visible signs that anything had changed. Apple had not yet issued a statement, and no information had reached the public. The final 24 hours had now reached their conclusion, not through a dramatic event, but through a quiet and expected end. What followed would be procedural rather than personal, and public rather than private. The shift from silence to announcement had not yet begun, but it was inevitable. For the moment, Everything remained still. The house stayed quiet. The people present did not change. And the story of Steve Jobs' final day remained unseen, exactly as he had intended. After Steve Jobs' passing, the immediate response inside the house remained restrained and deliberate. There was no rush to inform anyone outside the family, and no public-facing actions were taken at that moment. The focus stayed on maintaining privacy and handling the situation calmly. Those present followed established procedures rather than improvising responses. There were no emergency calls placed and no medical personnel summoned to the home. Jobs' death had occurred in the expected manner, and there was no uncertainty about what had happened or how it should be handled. Over the next several hours, arrangements were made quietly and without publicity. The house remained closed, and access continued to be limited. There were no visible signs outside the residence indicating that a death had occurred. No vehicles arrived, and no security changes were noticeable. During this period, Apple was not yet informed publicly. There were no internal messages released to employees, and no statements prepared for the media. The company's leadership had anticipated this moment, but formal communication was intentionally delayed until the appropriate steps were taken. The absence of immediate announcements was consistent with Jobs' approach to privacy. Even major life events had always been disclosed on his terms, often after the fact. This final moment followed the same pattern, with information being carefully controlled rather than released spontaneously. Family members remained together during this time. There were no discussions about public reaction or legacy. The emphasis remained on the present and on maintaining a quiet environment. Nothing about the setting suggested urgency or disruption. Outside the home, the night transitioned into early morning without incident. The surrounding area remained calm, and daily routines resumed for those unaware of what had occurred. There was still no indication to the public that this day would soon become significant. As the early hours passed, preparations began for the necessary official steps that would follow. These actions were administrative rather than emotional, and they were handled discreetly. The transition from private loss to public acknowledgement was approaching, but it had not yet occurred. At this stage, the story remained entirely contained within the family. The world had not yet been informed, and Apple had not yet spoken. The final 24 hours had ended, but the public narrative had not begun. That shift would come next, moving the story from silence into acknowledgement. As the morning progressed, the process of moving from a private moment to an official confirmation began quietly. The information about Steve Jobs' death was shared internally in a controlled and limited way. There was no rush to make the news public and no immediate outreach to the media. Apple senior leadership was informed first. This communication was factual and brief, focused on confirmation rather than explanation. There were no internal debates or uncertainty about what had occurred. Jobs' condition had been known, and the timing, while significant, was not unexpected. The company began preparing a public statement. The language was kept simple and direct, consistent with Apple's communication style and with Jobs' own preference for clarity. There was no attempt to add detail beyond what could be confirmed. No cause of death was elaborated on at this stage, and no personal information was included. At the same time, Pixar was also informed. Jobs had remained closely connected to the company, and its leadership followed a similar approach in preparing a response. Both organizations treated the moment as one of acknowledgement rather than analysis. Throughout this period, the family remained separate from the corporate response. There was no overlap between personal grieving and public messaging. Decisions about announcements were handled by company leadership, allowing the family to maintain privacy and distance from the public. Process. No interviews were arranged and no representatives spoke to reporters. The communication strategy was deliberate and restrained. The goal was to confirm the fact of Jobs' death without inviting speculation or commentary. As preparations continued, the timing of the announcement was carefully considered. The news would be released once the necessary internal steps were completed, not in reaction to external pressure. This approach ensured that the first public acknowledgement would be controlled and accurate. Outside the companies involved, the public remained unaware. News outlets had not yet reported anything, and there were no visible signs that a major announcement was imminent. The transition from silence to public awareness was approaching, but it had not yet occurred. At this stage, the story was moving out of the private sphere and into an official one. What had been known only to family and a small group of individuals was about to be shared with the world, marking the beginning of the public response to Steve Jobs' death. Once the internal preparations were complete, the decision was made to inform the public. Apple released a brief statement confirming that Steve Jobs had died. The message was direct and restrained, identifying him as Apple's co-founder and former chief executive officer. No additional details were included beyond confirmation of his passing. At the same time, Apple updated its website. The homepage was replaced with a black and white image of Steve Jobs, accompanied only by his name and the years of his birth and death. There were no slogans, no promotional elements, and no additional text. The simplicity of the presentation reflected both the company's design philosophy and the tone of the moment. Pixar issued its own statement shortly afterward. The message acknowledged Jobs' role as a founder and his influence on the company's creative direction. Like Apple's announcement, it avoided elaboration and speculation. The focus remained on recognition rather than explanation. As the news became public, media outlets around the world began reporting the confirmation. Headlines appeared across technology, business, and general news platforms. The reporting focused on Jobs' role in shaping Apple and the broader technology industry, rather than on the specifics of his final hours. Apple employees learned of the news through internal communication channels. There were no immediate public events or gatherings organized by the company. Employees were encouraged to reflect privately, and some Apple retail locations later placed simple notices acknowledging Jobs' passing. Throughout this period, no additional information was released by the family. There were no interviews, statements, or appearances. The separation between the public acknowledgement and the private handling of the loss remained intact. The announcement did not trigger confusion or controversy. There were no conflicting reports or questions about the circumstances of Jobs' death. The controlled nature of the communication ensured that the focus stayed on confirmation and legacy rather than speculation. As the day continued, the story spread rapidly across different regions and time zones. What had been a private moment inside a Palo Alto home was now a global news event. Despite the scale of the response, the information available to the public remained limited to what had been officially confirmed. The transition from silence to worldwide awareness was complete. Steve Jobs' death had been acknowledged, but the details of his final day remained largely private. The narrative was no longer confined to a small group, yet it retained the restraint that had characterized every stage of the process so far. As the confirmation spread, reactions began to emerge across different parts of the world. Technology leaders, business figures, and public institutions acknowledged Steve Jobs' death, through carefully worded statements. The focus of these responses was consistent, recognition of his influence rather than discussion of his final days. Messages came from across the technology industry, including companies that had competed directly with Apple. These statements avoided personal detail and emphasized Jobs' role in shaping modern computing, consumer electronics, and digital culture. The tone remained professional and measured. Media coverage expanded rapidly. Major news organizations reported on Jobs' career, tracing his path from Apple's founding to his return in the late 1990s and the product launches that followed. His illness was mentioned only in broad terms, reflecting the limited information that had always been available publicly. Outside Apple stores, some members of the public began to gather. Flowers, handwritten notes, and small tributes appeared at entrances in several cities. These gatherings were informal and spontaneous, not organized by the company. Apple did not promote or manage these responses, allowing them to remain personal rather than ceremonial. Online platforms filled with messages from users who had followed Apple's products for years. Many focused on how Jobs' work had influenced daily life rather than on the circumstances of his death. The response reflected the scale of his impact rather than curiosity about private details. Governments and public officials also issued brief acknowledgments. These statements followed the same restrained pattern, recognizing Jobs as a figure who had contributed significantly to innovation and economic growth. There were no official ceremonies announced, and no public memorials planned by the state. Throughout this period, Apple maintained its reserved approach. The company did not provide additional statements or commentary beyond its initial announcement. There were no press conferences and no interviews scheduled. The narrative remained focused on Jobs' work and legacy, not on the final hours of his life. The family continued to remain out of public view. No appearances were made, and no personal reflections were shared beyond what had already been released. The boundary between public recognition and private loss remained firm. As the day progressed, the scale of the reaction became clear, but the information available did not expand. The story was being told repeatedly, but not deepened with new details. The public conversation centered on what Steve Jobs had built, not on how his life had ended. In this way, the response mirrored the manner of his final day, wide in impact, limited in disclosure, and shaped by deliberate restraint rather than exposure. As public attention continued to grow, the handling of Steve Jobs' death remained consistent with the restraint that had defined every stage so far. While the world reacted, arrangements were made quietly and without publicity for the final formalities. There were no announcements about services, no schedules released, and no invitations extended beyond a very small circle. A private funeral was held on October 7, 2011. The service was limited to family members and close friends. No details about the location or proceedings were shared publicly, and no media coverage was permitted. This approach reflected Jobs' long-standing preference for privacy and control over personal matters. There were no public memorials organized by Apple or any other institution. The company did not host an event, unveil a monument, or plan a ceremony. Instead, Apple continued operating as usual, allowing employees and customers to respond individually rather than through a centralized display. Those who attended the service did not speak publicly about it. No descriptions, photographs, or recordings were released. The absence of information was deliberate, ensuring that the final farewell remained personal rather than symbolic. At the Palo Alto residence, activity gradually returned to normal. There were no extended closures or visible changes. The house did not become a site of public attention or pilgrimage. The setting where Jobs had spent his final hours remained private, just as it had been during the illness itself. The lack of spectacle stood in contrast to the scale of Jobs's public influence. Despite having shaped one of the most valuable and visible companies in the world, his final arrangements were handled without ceremony. This contrast was not emphasized or explained. It simply reflected the choices he had made. In the days that followed, Apple employees were encouraged to reflect internally. Some retail locations placed small notices or allowed customers to leave messages, but there was no coordinated effort to formalize these responses. The company avoided turning the moment into an event. The public conversation continued, but it began to shift away from immediate reaction and toward longer-term reflection. Articles focused on Jobs's career, his design philosophy, and the products that had defined his legacy. The details of his final day remained largely untouched. As this phase concluded, the process that followed Steve Jobs's passing reached a natural pause. The necessary formalities had been completed, and the boundary between public recognition and private closure had been maintained. What remained was not an unfolding story, but a settled one, shaped by the same deliberate restraint that had guided every decision up to this point. As the days passed, the public narrative around Steve Jobs gradually settled into a fixed shape. The facts of his death did not change, and no new details about his final hours were released. What was known remained limited to what had been officially confirmed, and that boundary was never crossed. Jobs had died peacefully at home, surrounded by family. The cause of death was respiratory arrest due to complications from pancreatic cancer. A private funeral had been held, and Apple had acknowledged his passing in a restrained and deliberate manner. Beyond this, no additional information was provided, and none was sought from those closest to him. This absence of detail was not the result of secrecy or omission. It reflected a clear choice. Throughout his life, Jobs had maintained a strict separation between his public role and his private world. That separation remained intact at the end. The final day was not documented for public understanding, and it was never intended to be. In the weeks and months that followed, discussions about Jobs focused almost entirely on his work. His role in shaping Apple, his influence on technology and design, and the products he helped bring into existence became the center of attention. The details of his illness and final hours did not become part of that conversation. There were no posthumous revelations, no diaries released, and no accounts that altered the understanding of his final day. The story did not expand beyond its original outline. What had been shared remained sufficient, and what had been kept private stayed that way. This restraint created a clear ending rather than an ongoing narrative. There was no speculation to resolve, and no unanswered public questions that demanded explanation. The final 24 hours were not framed as a mystery, but as a quiet conclusion to a long and public life. In this way, the end of Steve Jobs' life mirrored many of the decisions he made while living. Control, simplicity, and clarity defined both his work and his final moments. The world was informed, but not invited inside. What remains is a complete account based on confirmed facts, set within clear boundaries. Much of the final day remains private by design, not because it was hidden, but because it was never meant to be shared. The story does not extend beyond that point. It ends where it was intended to end, with the facts established, the legacy understood, and the final hours left exactly as they were lived.